16-year-old Daniel Cooper learned what true emptiness felt like the day they closed his grandmother's casket. Not the theatrical, movie-style grief where people collapse and wail, but the quiet, suffocating kind that sits in your chest like a stone and makes breathing feel like work. He stood in the funeral home's parking lot in Columbus, Ohio, watching strangers who'd never visited her when she was alive now wiping tears they didn't mean, and understood with absolute clarity that he was completely alone in the world. His grandmother, Margaret, had raised him since he was 3. After his parents died in a house fire, he was too young to remember clearly. Just fragments, really. The smell of smoke, someone's arms lifting him, the sound of sirens that still made him flinch 16 years later. She'd been a retired postal worker living on Social Security and a pension that barely covered groceries, but she'd made space for him in her one-bedroom apartment, sleeping on the couch for 13 years so he could have the bedroom, working part-time jobs under the table to afford school supplies and the occasional birthday present from the dollar store. Now she was gone, and the apartment lease was up in 30 days, and Daniel had nowhere to go. The social worker, a tired woman named Mrs. Patterson with coffee stains on her blouse and sympathy that felt rehearsed, had explained his options during their meeting at the county office 3 days after the funeral. Foster care, though at 16 he was too old for most families to want him. A group home where he'd share a room with 3 other boys until he aged out of the system at 18. Emancipation, if he could prove financial independence, which was laughable given he had $68 in his pocket and a part-time job at a car wash that paid minimum wage. But then she'd mentioned something else, sliding a manila envelope across her desk like it was an afterthought, a footnote to his life falling apart, an inheritance. The word felt wrong, too formal for someone like him. Inheritances were for rich people in novels, for families with lawyers and estates and complicated wills, not for orphan teenagers who'd eaten cereal for dinner more times than they could count because that was all there was. The envelope contained a letter from a probate attorney in Lexington, Kentucky, a man named Howard Briggs, whose letterhead looked expensive in a way that made Daniel uncomfortable. The language was dense, full of legal terms that took 3 readings to understand, but the basic facts were simple enough to make his head spin. His grandmother's sister, a woman named Ruth Holloway, who Daniel had never met, never even heard mentioned in any conversation he could recall, had died 7 months ago and left him property, 40 acres in rural Kentucky, about 90 miles south of Lexington, in a county called Madison, a farmhouse, a barn, land that had been in the Holloway family for 3 generations, and a requirement he had to come see the property and sign documents within 45 days, or it would be sold at auction to settle outstanding debts owed to the county. That was 42 days ago. Now Daniel stood at a Greyhound station in Richmond, Kentucky at 6 in the morning, watching the sun come up over mountains he'd only seen in photographs from tourism websites, with a backpack containing everything he owned, 2 pairs of jeans, 4 t-shirts, a hoodie, the envelope with the legal documents, his grandmother's photo album, and the last $73 he had to his name after buying the bus ticket. The air smelled different here, less like exhaust and concrete, more like earth and something green he couldn't name. It made him feel foreign to himself, like he'd stepped into someone else's life by accident. The attorney had arranged for the property keys to be left with a local real estate office, a small storefront on Main Street in a town called Berea that looked like it existed in a time warp. All brick buildings and American flags and hand-painted signs advertising businesses that probably hadn't changed owners in 50 years. The woman at the real estate office was in her 50s, with short grey hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, and she looked at Daniel with the particular expression adults got when they saw a teenager alone and knew something was wrong, but didn't want to pry. "You're the Holloway boy," she said, not a question, and Daniel nodded because correcting her felt like too much effort. "Cooper," he wanted to say. His name was Daniel Cooper, But Holloway was apparently what connected him to this place, to this aunt he'd never known, to this property he was about to see for the first time. She handed him an envelope containing 2 keys, one old and brass, one newer silver, and a printed sheet with directions. "It's about 20 minutes out," she said. "Road's not great once you turn off the highway. Ruth didn't maintain much toward the end. Stopped coming into town about 6 years back. Sheriff found her when the mail piled up and the neighbors called." Daniel felt like he should say something, express gratitude or sadness or acknowledgement, but all he managed was a quiet thank you before walking out into the morning heat that was already building, the kind of humid warmth that made his shirt stick to his back. He couldn't afford a taxi, so he walked, backpack heavy on his shoulders, following the directions that took him out of town on a 2-lane highway lined with tobacco fields and split-rail fences. Cars passed occasionally, drivers glancing at him with curiosity but not stopping, and Daniel kept his head down, focused on putting one foot in front of the other because forward motion was all he had. After an hour, his feet aching in sneakers that were wearing through at the soles, he reached the turnoff, a gravel road that disappeared into trees so thick they created a tunnel of green shade. The directions said 2 miles down this road, and Daniel walked it in silence, broken only by birdsong and the crunch of his footsteps, until the trees opened up and he saw it. The farmhouse looked like something from a postcard that had been left in the sun too long. Colors faded, edges curled. It was a single-story structure, white clapboard siding gone grey in places where paint had peeled away completely. A front porch that sagged in the middle like a broken smile, windows with shutters hanging at odd angles. The roof was missing shingles in patches, and Daniel could see blue tarp someone had stapled down years ago, now torn and flapping in the breeze. Behind the house, maybe 100 yards back, stood a barn that looked simultaneously more solid and more precarious, its red paint weathered to a dull rust color, massive doors hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-yell. Everything spoke of neglect, of time passing without intervention, of a place where someone had simply stopped trying. Daniel stood in the overgrown driveway, weeds growing knee-high through what had once been gravel, and felt something unexpected, not disappointment exactly, but a strange kind of recognition. This place looked like he felt, abandoned and forgotten, and still somehow standing. He approached the house slowly, using the brass key to unlock a front door that stuck in its frame and required his full weight to shove open, hinges screaming in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust and silence, the particular quality of quiet that comes from years without human voices. The furniture was still there, covered in white sheets that had turned grey, shapes like ghosts in the dim light, filtering through dirty windows. A couch, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair positioned near the front window. Daniel pulled back one sheet and found a floral pattern underneath, fabric intact but smelling of mothballs and thyme. In the kitchen, dishes sat in a drying rack beside the sink, plates and cups arranged like someone had washed them intending to put them away later and never got the chance. There were 3 rooms in total, the main living area that connected kitchen and sitting space, a bedroom with a bed made so neatly the corners were tucked military-style despite years of dust settling over the quilt, and a small bathroom with rust stains in the tub, and a mirror that showed Daniel's reflection, fractured by age spots in the silver backing. But it was the bedroom that stopped him, made him stand in the doorway staring at something that didn't make sense. The walls were covered in photographs, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, arranged in clusters without frames, just thumb-tacked directly to the faded wallpaper. Horses. Every single photograph was of horses. Some were clearly professional shots, glossy finish even under the dust, showing magnificent thoroughbreds in winners' circles with flower garlands draped across their necks. Others were candid, horses in fields, horses being groomed, horses running with their manes flying like flags. And in many of them, always at the edge of the frame, like she was trying not to be noticed, was a woman Daniel assumed was Ruth. Tall, thin, with short, dark hair going grey, wearing jeans and work shirts in every photo, never smiling at the camera, but always watching the horses with an expression Daniel recognized, even though he'd never seen it on his own face. Devotion, bordering on obsession. He spent 20 minutes studying those photographs, trying to understand who this woman had been, why his grandmother had never mentioned her, what could make someone dedicate their walls to images of animals rather than family. Then he saw it, tucked in the corner near the closet, a photograph different from the rest. Larger, printed on thick paper that had yellowed but not faded, showing a massive chestnut horse with a white blaze down its face, muscles defined like sculpture, captured mid-stride with all four hooves off the ground in a moment of suspended grace. Someone had written on the bottom in blue ink that had faded to grey, "Big Red Belmont Stakes, 1973. Daniel didn't know much about horse racing, but he knew that name. Everyone knew that name. Secretariat. The horse that had won by 31 lengths, the record that still stood, the performance they still showed on sports channels during Triple Crown season. He stared at that photograph for a long time, trying to understand its significance, why Ruth had given it the place of honor in her shrine, before finally leaving the house to explore the rest of the property. The barn was bigger than he'd expected, tall enough that his footsteps echoed when he walked through the main doors into a space that smelled of hay and leather and something else, something alive. The interior was organized with the precision of someone who'd spent decades doing the same tasks. Tools hanging on pegboard walls, their outlines drawn in marker so you'd know exactly where each belonged. Feed bags stacked in a corner, 50-pound sacks of something labeled Senior Equine Feed, with an expiration date from 2 months ago that made Daniel's stomach drop, because it meant someone had been here recently, buying supplies, maintaining something. Saddles sat on racks gathering dust, bridles hung from hooks, and in a small office area at the back of the barn, behind a door that was unlocked, Daniel found a desk buried under paperwork. Bills, mostly, addressed to Ruth Holloway, from veterinary clinics and feed suppliers and farriers. Services Daniel had to look up on his phone, using the last of his data to understand. Medical care for horses, food for horses, hoof care for horses. Thousands of dollars spent over years, decades even. The oldest receipts he found dating back to 1988, all meticulously filed in folders organized by year. But it was the ledger that made everything click into place. A hard-bound notebook with entries in the same shaky handwriting he'd seen on the photograph downstairs. A record of daily care spanning 40 years. Feeding times, veterinary visits, behavioral notes, observations about weather and mood and health. The entries were dated, the most recent from 8 months ago, just 2 weeks before Ruth had died, according to the date on the death certificate in the legal paperwork. Shadow's arthritis, worse in morning, gave extra time before feeding, still eating well, still wants to be near the fence at sunset, still watching the road like he's waiting. Shadow. Daniel read the name 3 times before understanding hit him like cold water. There was a horse here, or there had been. Ruth had been caring for a horse right up until she died, and those feed bags in the corner with their recent expiration dates meant someone, the attorney maybe, or a neighbor, had been continuing that care while the property sat in probate limbo. Daniel left the barn and walked to the back of the property, past an overgrown garden where raspberry bushes had taken over what might have once been organized rows, past a chicken coop with its door hanging open and weeds growing through the wire mesh, to a paddock that stretched maybe half an acre, enclosed by a fence that was in better repair than anything else on the property. And standing in the far corner, barely visible in the shadow of an oak tree that grew at the property line, was a horse. Daniel stopped breathing. The horse was grey, the colour of storm clouds, coat dull but not dirty, standing with its head lowered in a way that spoke of age and weariness. Before we continue, I want to pause here for something important. If you're finding Daniel's story compelling, if you're curious about what happens next with this mysterious horse and the life-changing discovery that's about to unfold, Do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is built on stories of unexpected inheritance, second chances, and the moments that change everything. And I promise you, this one is going somewhere you won't see coming. Also, drop a comment below. Have you ever inherited something that completely changed your perspective on life? Maybe it wasn't worth millions, maybe it was just an object or a letter, but it shifted something in you. Share your story. I read every single comment, and this community thrives on these shared experiences of transformation. Daniel approached the fence slowly, instinctively understanding that sudden movements would be wrong, that this creature who'd been alone for months deserved respect in his approach. The horse raised its head as Daniel got closer, and even from 20 feet away he could see the signs of extreme age, the pronounced sway in the back, the ribs visible through the coat. The careful way it distributed its weight like standing required concentration. But the eyes, when the horse looked directly at him, were clear and intelligent, holding an awareness that made Daniel feel seen in a way he hadn't experienced since his grandmother died. This wasn't just an animal. This was a being, something with history and memory and presence. He reached the fence and stood there, hands gripping the top rail, and the horse watched him with those ancient eyes for a long moment before taking slow, deliberate steps toward him. Hooves moving carefully across ground it clearly knew intimately. When the horse reached the fence, it lowered its head toward Daniel's chest level, close enough that he could feel the warmth of its breath, could see the white hairs mixed through the grey coat, could count the whiskers on its muzzle. Daniel had never touched a horse before, had no frame of reference for what to do, so he simply raised one hand slowly and placed it on the side of the horse's neck, feeling muscles shift beneath skin, feeling the steady pulse of a heartbeat that had been keeping rhythm for longer than Daniel had been alive. "Hey," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion he didn't fully understand. "I'm Daniel. I guess we both got left behind here." The horse exhaled, a sound that felt like agreement, like acknowledgement, and stood still, accepting Daniel's touch with a patience that spoke of decades learning to trust, despite having every reason not to. They stayed like that for several minutes, boy and horse both orphaned in their own ways, both trying to understand what happened next. Daniel spent that first night in the farmhouse, sleeping on the couch because the bedroom with its wall of photographs felt too intimate, too much like trespassing in someone's private shrine. He'd found canned goods in the kitchen pantry, soup and beans with expiration dates from 2 years ago that he ate cold because he didn't know if the utilities were connected and was too afraid to try the stove. In the morning, using the last of his phone's battery before it died completely and he had no way to charge it, he called the attorney, Howard Briggs, and asked the questions that had kept him awake most of the night. Who was taking care of the horse? How long had it been alone? What was he supposed to do? Briggs had sighed, the sound of a man who'd been expecting this call and dreading it. "Local vet's been coming by twice a week," he'd explained. "Checking on the animal, bringing feed, billing the estate. We've been covering it from Ruth's remaining funds, but those are nearly exhausted. The horse is part of the property, legally speaking. If you take ownership, you take responsibility for its care. If you decline the inheritance, the property goes to auction, and the horse, well, at his age, most likely outcome is humane euthanasia." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Euthanasia. They were talking about killing this horse because it was old and inconvenient and cost money to maintain. "How old is he?" Daniel had asked, his voice tight. 39, Briggs had said, which is extraordinarily old for a horse. Most don't make it past 30. This one's been defying odds for years, but he won't live forever. Ruth spent her last decades caring for him, spent every penny she had on his maintenance. There are veterinary bills in her files going back to 1985. Continuous care for the same animal. It bankrupted her, essentially. The farm has a mortgage she stopped paying 3 years ago. Back taxes owed. The land's worth maybe $200,000 if you could find a buyer, but after debts are settled, there'd be almost nothing left. Daniel had thanked him and hung up, sitting in Ruth's living room with dust motes floating in morning sunlight, trying to process what he'd just learned. This woman, his great-aunt who died alone and been found by a sheriff doing a wellness check, had spent 40 years and all her money keeping one old horse alive. Why? He found part of the answer in Ruth's desk, buried under the veterinary bills and feed receipts, in a box that had been shoved to the back of a drawer and sealed with packing tape. Inside were letters, dozens of them, dating from 1985 to just 6 months before Ruth died, all from the same sender, various breeding farms and racing syndicates, mostly in Kentucky and New York. Daniel read them in chronological order, watching the tone shift from polite inquiry to aggressive demand to legal threat to desperate pleading. They all wanted the same thing: access to the horse in Ruth's paddock. They referenced bloodlines and genetic testing and breeding rights. They mentioned names Daniel had to Google on the last sliver of his phone's battery: Secretariat, Bold Ruler, Something Royal, names that meant nothing to him, but clearly meant everything to these people writing letters offering increasing amounts of money. $5,000 in 1987, $50,000 in 1995, $500,000 in 2003, $2 million in 2015. The most recent letter, dated 6 months before Ruth's death, was from something called the Thoroughbred Heritage Foundation, and the offer was $12 million for breeding rights and genetic access to the stallion known as Shadow's Legacy, documented biological offspring of the 1973 Triple Crown champion Secretariat. Daniel read that number 4 times. $12 million. For the old grey horse standing in the paddock behind the house, the one who could barely walk without careful steps, the one who was supposed to be euthanized because he cost too much to keep alive. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. He kept reading, found Ruth's responses, handwritten letters that had been photocopied before sending, her words firm and unwavering. Shadow is not for sale. He will never be bred. He will live out his life here in peace, and when he dies, he will be buried on this land. No amount of money will change my answer. Please stop writing. But they hadn't stopped writing. The letters continued for decades, the offers climbing, the language becoming more aggressive, some threatening legal action, others trying sympathy, explaining how important Shadow's genetics were to preserving Secretariat's legacy, how much the racing world needed access to this bloodline. Ruth had ignored them all. Daniel found veterinary records next, thick files documenting Shadow's entire life from birth in 1986 to present day. The birth certificate listed the sire as Secretariat, via frozen collection dated March 1985. And the dam as a mare named Twilight Runner, who died in 1987. The attending veterinarian had been Marcus Holloway, Ruth's husband, who, according to his death certificate in the family documents, had died in a car accident in 1988, just 2 years after Shadow was born. There were notes in Marcus's handwriting, clinical observations about the foal's development, his conformation, his resemblance to his legendary sire, and then, stapled to the back of the birth file, a letter that explained everything. It was addressed to Ruth, dated 1 week before Marcus died, and it read like a confession. My darling Ruth, if you're reading this, something has happened to me, and you need to know the truth about Shadow. I stole him, not the horse himself, but the means to create him. I was working at the breeding facility when Secretariat died in 1990, when they were collecting final samples for the syndicate members who owned breeding rights. I saw what they did to him in those last months, the constant procedures, the stress, the way they treated him like a machine instead of a living being. When he died, I took one collection vial, one that should have been destroyed per protocol. I kept it frozen, hid it, and when we lost our son, when the doctors said we'd never have children, I used it. Not to breed a champion, not to make money, but to create something, to have something to care for, to give my grief purpose. Daniel's hands were shaking as he continued reading. The syndicate doesn't know Shadow exists. The Jockey Club has no record of his birth. He's unregistered, undocumented officially, a ghost in the thoroughbred world. If they find him, they'll take him. They'll use him until there's nothing left to use. They'll extract every ounce of genetic material they can and call it preservation while destroying what makes him alive. Ruth, I'm asking you to keep him secret, to let him live quietly, to protect him from the world that would see him only as valuable DNA. He's not a commodity. He's family. He's the son I couldn't have otherwise. Please forgive me for the burden I'm leaving you. The letter was signed with Marcus's name and a date from September 1988. 1 week later, according to the death certificate, his car had gone off a mountain road during a storm, the official cause listed as accidental, though someone had written in the margin of the police report that brake lines showed signs of tampering. Investigation inconclusive. Daniel sat in the dusty office, surrounded by 40 years of secrets, and understood finally what he'd inherited. Not just a farm, not just an old horse, but a responsibility that had consumed 2 lives already and was now asking him to make the same choice. Protect or profit, hide or reveal, care or cash out. Daniel walked back to the paddock, the box of letters tucked under his arm, and looked at Shadow with new understanding. This wasn't just an old horse. This was the son of the greatest racehorse in American history, a living connection to a legend, born in secret and kept hidden for nearly 4 decades, while the entire thoroughbred racing world searched for any trace of Secretariat's undocumented offspring. Shadow stood in his usual spot under the oak tree, and when Daniel approached the fence, the horse walked toward him, with those careful arthritic steps, and Daniel felt the weight of what Ruth and Marcus had done, the sacrifice they'd made, the life they'd given up to keep this secret. Ruth had died alone and broke, had let her property fall into disrepair, had stopped paying her mortgage and let the bank start foreclosure proceedings, all to keep feeding a horse that people would pay millions to access. She'd chosen Shadow over everything else, over comfort, over security, over any kind of normal life, because she'd made a promise to a husband who died under suspicious circumstances after stealing genetic material worth a fortune. Daniel spent the next 3 days reading everything in Ruth's files, educating himself about horse racing, about Secretariat's legacy, about why Shadow mattered so much to so many people. He learned that Secretariat had been syndicated for breeding at a record $6 million in 1973, divided into shares that gave wealthy investors breeding rights to his offspring. He learned that Secretariat's sons and daughters had gone on to sire and produce champions, that his bloodline shaped modern racing, that genetic analysis of his heart after death revealed it was almost twice the normal size, a physical mutation that likely contributed to his unprecedented speed and stamina. He learned that the racing industry treated champion stallions as commodities, that they spent their retirement years in breeding sheds, that a single collection could be divided and sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars, that the value was in the genetics, not the animal. And he learned that at 39 years old, Shadow was one of the oldest living thoroughbreds in the world, that most horses his age were long dead, that his continued existence was itself remarkable, and suggested he might have inherited more than just his father's speed, maybe that extraordinary heart too, that genetic anomaly that made Secretariat special. The veterinarian who'd been checking on Shadow arrived on the 4th day, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Helen Torres, who drove up in a truck with a mobile clinic built into the bed and greeted Daniel with cautious warmth. "You must be the nephew," she said, though Daniel didn't correct her on the specifics of relation. "I've been worried about what would happen to Shadow. Ruth made me promise years ago that if anything happened to her, I'd keep him comfortable, but I can't work for free indefinitely." She examined Shadow while Daniel watched, running her hands over his legs, checking his teeth, listening to his heart with a stethoscope, while the horse stood patiently like he'd done this 10,000 times. "He's in remarkable condition for his age." she said finally. Arthritis in all 4 legs, some digestive issues common in geriatric horses, eyesight's failing a bit, but his heart's strong, lungs are clear, and he's still got good quality of life. Ruth took excellent care of him. He could have another year, maybe 2 if we're lucky, but at this age, every day's a gift. Daniel asked her about the letters, about the money people had offered, about what would happen if the world knew where Shadow was. Dr. Torres sighed, leaning against the fence while Shadow grazed nearby. I've known about him since I started treating him 15 years ago, she said. Ruth swore me to secrecy, and I kept that promise because I understood what she was protecting him from. If the breeding syndicates found him, if the jockey club verified his bloodline, Shadow would spend whatever time he has left being poked and prodded and harvested for genetic material. They'd justify it by calling it preservation, by saying they're honoring Secretariat's legacy, but really they'd just be making money. Stud fees from his offspring would be worth millions. Frozen semen from him could be sold for decades after he dies. To them, he's not a living being with rights and dignity. He's a resource to be extracted. She looked at Daniel with the kind of directness that demanded honesty in return. Ruth died protecting him. She chose poverty over profit, chose his peace over her comfort. Now that choice is yours. You could contact those breeding farms, sell access to him, and walk away with enough money to change your life completely. Or you could do what Ruth did, finish what she started, let him live out his time in the only home he's ever known. That night, Daniel sat on the farmhouse porch and watched sunset turn the sky orange and pink and purple, watched Shadow stand at his fence line, facing west, like he did every evening according to Ruth's journal entries, and thought about choices. He was 16 years old, with no family, no home, no money, no clear path forward, and he'd just been handed a lottery ticket worth millions of dollars if he was willing to sell out a horse who'd done nothing wrong except be born with valuable DNA. The practical choice was obvious. Contact the Thoroughbred Heritage Foundation, negotiate a sale, use the money to finish high school, go to college, build a life where he didn't have to struggle the way his grandmother had, the way Ruth had, the way he'd been struggling for as long as he could remember. But sitting there watching Shadow's silhouette against the sunset, Daniel thought about what the practical choice would cost, not in dollars but in something harder to measure, in integrity, in honor, in the kind of person he'd be choosing to become at 16 with this decision. His grandmother had raised him on nothing, had sacrificed everything to give him stability, had worked herself to exhaustion so he could have a bedroom and school supplies and the kind of childhood that didn't feel defined by poverty. She'd never taken the easy way, never chosen comfort over principle, and Daniel suddenly understood that this moment was where he decided if he'd learned anything from her sacrifice. He called Howard Briggs the next morning, using Dr. Torres's phone after explaining what he wanted to do. "I'm keeping the property," Daniel said. "I'm taking responsibility for Shadow. I need to know what that means, legally, financially, what I'm signing up for." Briggs was quiet for a long moment before responding, and when he did, his voice had lost its professional distance. "It means you're accepting a mortgage Ruth defaulted on, about $80,000 owed to the bank. It means accepting roughly $30,000 in back taxes. It means taking on the cost of caring for a geriatric horse, which Dr. Torres estimates at about $1,500 monthly for feed, supplements, and basic veterinary care. It means you'd be financially underwater immediately, with no income, no way to pay these debts, and you'd likely lose the property to foreclosure within 6 months. Daniel had expected this, had spent half the night doing math on paper he'd found in Ruth's desk, calculating impossible numbers. "What if I got a job?" he asked. "What if I worked, paid what I could, asked the bank for a payment plan?" Briggs sighed. "You're 16. Legally, you can't even sign these documents without a court-appointed guardian. You'd need to petition for emancipation, prove you can support yourself, convince a judge this is viable. And even then, Daniel, the numbers don't work. You'd need to earn more than most adults make just to keep the utilities on and the horse fed. There was a long silence, and then Briggs said something that changed everything. But there might be another option. What if you sold breeding rights but kept the horse? Daniel's heart started racing. Explain. Ruth refused to sell Shadow or allow any breeding because she was protecting him from exploitation, from being treated as a commodity, from spending his final years in a breeding shed being subjected to constant procedures. But what if you negotiated terms that protected his welfare? What if you sold limited breeding rights with strict conditions that Shadow never leaves this property, that all procedures are done here under veterinary supervision of your choosing, that any sign of distress ends the agreement immediately, that he lives and dies on this land, no matter what? The breeding syndicates want his genetics. They want to continue Secretariat's line, but they don't necessarily need to own him to do that. You could structure a deal that gives them what they want, while honoring Ruth's promise to keep Shadow safe. Daniel thought about this, turning it over in his mind, looking for the catch, the compromise that would betray Ruth's trust. Would they agree to that, he asked. For the right to breed the only known unregistered son of Secretariat? Briggs said. I think they'd agree to almost anything. Let me make some calls, test the waters, see what kind of deal we could structure. But Daniel, understand, if we do this, you're committing to staying here, to being Shadow's guardian, to enforcing those conditions for however long he lives. You'd be taking on what Ruth did, making the same sacrifice, just with better financial support. Daniel looked out the window at Shadow grazing in morning light, at the farm that was falling apart, at the life he'd inherited that made no sense, and somehow felt more right than anything ever had. Make the calls, he said. The negotiations took 6 weeks, 6 weeks of conference calls on Dr. Torres's phone that Daniel took sitting on Ruth's porch, listening to lawyers and breeding syndicate representatives speak in careful language about genetic preservation and bloodline continuation, while really talking about money, about the value of Shadow's DNA, about what they'd pay for access to the last piece of Secretariat's legacy. The Thoroughbred Heritage Foundation made the first serious offer, $8 million for unlimited breeding rights, with Shadow remaining on the property. But their definition of unlimited included language about twice-weekly collections regardless of the horse's condition, with Daniel having no authority to refuse procedures. He turned it down. A syndicate from New York offered $12 million with more reasonable collection schedules, but wanted Shadow moved to a climate-controlled facility in Kentucky for optimal care, which defeated the entire purpose. Daniel refused. It was a breeding collective from Virginia that finally understood what he was trying to protect, or at least understood enough to structure a deal he could accept. $22 million for exclusive breeding rights to Shadow, with conditions written into the contract that Daniel's attorney, a woman named Patricia Delgado, who specialized in animal welfare law and worked pro bono after hearing his story, called the most restrictive breeding agreement she'd ever seen. Shadow would never leave the 40-acre property. All collections would be scheduled at minimum 2-week intervals, and only when Dr. Torres, who Daniel retained as Shadow's exclusive veterinarian with veto power over any procedures, certified he was in good health and not experiencing distress. Any sign of pain, anxiety, or declining health would immediately pause all breeding activities until Shadow recovered, or permanently if Dr. Torres determined the procedures were compromising his quality of life. The agreement lasted only as long as Shadow lived naturally, with Daniel having sole authority to make end-of-life decisions without input from the syndicate. And most importantly, Daniel maintained complete ownership of Shadow himself. The syndicate was purchasing access, not the horse, not the property, not control over anything except the right to attempt breeding under these strict conditions. The money hit Daniel's account on a Tuesday morning in October, transferred in stages as lawyers finalized paperwork and courts approved the emancipation petition that made 16-year-old Daniel Cooper legally independent and capable of entering binding contracts. $22 million, more money than he could conceptualize, more than most people saw in lifetimes, sitting in an account he could barely believe belonged to him. The first thing he did was pay off Ruth's mortgage, $83,000 that cleared the bank's claim on the property and made the 40 acres officially his. Then the back taxes, $31,000 to Madison County, that stopped the foreclosure proceedings. Then he hired contractors, local men who'd known Ruth and were shocked to learn about the inheritance, to repair the farmhouse roof, replace rotting porch boards, fix windows, update the electrical system that was a fire hazard, install a modern well pump so he'd have consistent water, restore the barn to full structural integrity, and build a covered arena where Shadow could exercise in bad weather without leaving the property. Dr. Torres helped him hire a stable manager, a retired horse trainer named James Wright, who'd spent 40 years working with thoroughbreds and understood immediately what Daniel was trying to accomplish. "You're giving him a dignified end," James said the day he moved into the small apartment they'd built in the renovated barn. "That's rare in this industry. Most champions get used up and discarded. Shadow's lucky, or maybe Ruth was just that determined." They established routines, feeding schedules, exercise patterns, veterinary monitoring, everything designed around Shadow's comfort and autonomy rather than breeding efficiency. The syndicate sent their reproductive specialists, clinical veterinarians who arrived with equipment and protocols, but Daniel and Dr. Torres controlled every interaction, and more than once they cancelled scheduled collections because Shadow seemed off, seemed stressed, seemed like he needed a break, and the contract gave them absolute authority to make those calls. Daniel enrolled in the local high school, finishing his junior year while living on a farm he owned, caring for a horse worth millions, navigating a life that felt surreal every morning when he woke up. He made friends slowly, people who knew him as the quiet kid who'd inherited the Holloway place, who didn't talk much about his past, but showed up to class and did his homework, and sometimes brought stories about Shadow that made teachers lean forward with interest. He started a college fund, not because he needed to. He could pay for any school in the country now, but because having it felt important, felt like honoring his grandmother's sacrifice by not taking education for granted. He donated money anonymously, setting up scholarships for foster kids in Ohio, for teenagers aging out of the system, for anyone who found themselves at 16 with nowhere to go, hoping that some other kid in his situation would have options he'd barely had. Shadow lived another 18 months after Daniel inherited him, 18 months of careful care and quiet dignity, of mornings where Daniel would sit on the fence and watch him graze, of evenings where they'd stand together at sunset facing west, like Ruth had noted in her journals. The breeding program produced 9 successful collections in that time, genetic material that would influence racing for the next generation, offspring that would carry Secretariat's legacy forward, but Shadow himself remained what Marcus and Ruth had wanted him to be, not a commodity, not a means to profit, just a horse living out his days in peace. He died on a spring morning with Daniel beside him, lying in the paddock under the oak tree where he'd spent so many years standing, Dr. Torres holding his head, while his heart, that extraordinary heart he'd inherited from his famous father, finally stopped after 39 years of beating steadily. They buried him there under the oak, Daniel and James and Dr. Torres digging the grave themselves despite offers to hire professionals, because it felt important to do this work with their own hands. Daniel had a marker made, simple granite with Shadow's name and dates, and a line from one of Ruth's journal entries that had struck him as perfect. He was loved, and that made him free. At the burial, standing over fresh earth with spring wind moving through new leaves, Daniel understood finally what he'd really inherited that day. He'd arrived with nothing but a backpack and nowhere to go. Not money, though the money had changed everything practically. Not property, though the farm was legally his now, but purpose, the kind that doesn't come from having everything, the kind that comes from choosing to protect something that can't protect itself, from honoring a trust, even when no one would blame you for breaking it, from being the wall between vulnerability and a world that sees everything as exploitable. He was 17 now, getting ready to graduate high school, with college applications sitting on Ruth's old desk, and a future that looked nothing like what he'd imagined back in Ohio, watching his grandmother's casket lower into ground. The farm was thriving, the breeding program had made him wealthy beyond imagination, and he'd honored Ruth's promise, had let Shadow live and die with dignity. But more than any of that, Daniel had learned what his grandmother had tried to teach him through her sacrifice, that the most important inheritances aren't measured in dollars, they're measured in choices, in the moments where you decide what kind of person you'll be when no one's watching, when the easy path would benefit you and the hard path only benefits someone else who can't thank you for it. He still got letters sometimes, from other syndicates wanting to negotiate, from racing historians wanting to document Shadow's story, from journalists wanting to write articles about the secret son of Secretariat who'd lived hidden for 4 decades. Daniel politely declined them all. Shadow's story wasn't for sale, wasn't for public consumption, wasn't entertainment or a cautionary tale or inspiration. It was private, sacred even, a testament to 2 people who'd chosen love over profit and a 16-year-old orphan who'd understood that some legacies are worth continuing even when they cost you everything. Daniel Cooper had inherited 40 acres and an old horse, and in return he'd gained something most people spent their whole lives searching for, the certainty that when it mattered most, when the choice was between easy money and hard principle, he'd chosen right, and that choice had made all the difference, not just for Shadow but for himself, for the kind of man he was becoming, for the inheritance he'd someday pass forward to whoever needed it next. Thank you so much for staying with Daniel's story all the way to the end. If this journey moved you, if you felt something shift inside while reading about a teenage orphan who chose protection over profit, please subscribe to this channel. We're building a community here of people who believe that the most valuable things in life aren't bought or sold, and your subscription helps these stories reach others who need to hear them. I'd love for you to share your own story in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right? What did that choice teach you? And most importantly, what did Daniel's story teach you about inheritance, responsibility, and the legacies we leave behind? Drop your thoughts below. Let's create a conversation that matters. This community thrives on your voices, your experiences, your wisdom. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's keep exploring these stories of transformation together. Thank you for being here.